Hello, students of history and political science. I'm Mr. Tesh, and welcome to Global Chat, where we explore the ins and outs of the field of study known as comparative politics. This video is a presentation for my AP Comparative Politics students on the topic of political economy. Political economy is its own subfield of political science. You can even earn a degree in it. And so in this unit, we're going to learn about some of the basics that we're going to need to understand how to compare countries in economic terms, and then how economics is connected to politics. Because this is a political science and not an economics course, I want to consider the following question throughout this presentation and our unit of study. How do people create and distribute wealth through politics? In other words, I want us to focus on the relationship between politics and economics and what effect they have on one another. To begin, let's take a look at these very basic concepts. First, we should define the term political economy so that we know what it is we are learning about. Then, we will define some basic economic concepts such as property and markets. Finally, we need to be able to distinguish between private and public goods. Like I said at the beginning, political economy is the study of the relationship between politics and markets. In this field of study, political scientists are often interested in things like why wealthy countries are more likely to become democratic, why some policies can promote economic growth while others don't, and how some individuals and groups in society use wealth to influence policymaking and the government in general. If you've ever taken an economics course, you've probably heard about markets and property. So markets are defined as the interactions between the forces of supply and demand. They're communities of buyers and sellers who are constantly interacting. To explain this a little better, let's use an example. Let's say I want to buy a new bicycle. If I go out and look for someone who can sell me a bicycle, I say that I'm in the market for a bicycle. As a buyer, I have a want, or to put it in economic terms, a demand for a new bicycle. If I find a business that sells bicycles that I like and for a price that I'm willing to pay, then that business has the supply for me, the thing that I want. Having bought a bicycle that I like, I can then call that bicycle my property. So property is what is defined in economics as the ownership of goods and services. Property refers to much more than bicycles too. It can refer to land, buildings, business, personal items, and even ideas. Pretty much anything that someone can claim as their own can be property. And this is where states get involved. In order for something to belong to someone, a state has to guarantee their right to that property. I couldn't just ride off on my new bike without paying for it, for example. If I did that, I would get in trouble with the law. Most of the things that we want and need, like my bicycle, are purchased on the free market in this way. Private businesses produce goods or services that people want, and people make choices to purchase what they want and what they can afford. These kinds of goods are called private goods. They're private because it is possible to exclude others from consuming them, and because consumption reduces the availability of these goods. Markets are an effective way of providing private goods, because competition between businesses creates incentives to produce the best products for the lowest prices possible. Take car companies, for example. A century ago, cars were something that very few people in the United States could afford. Over the years, though, manufacturers found ways to make cars more and more cheaply, while also improving their efficiency and quality. This is a good example of competition in action. But there are also limits to what markets and property can achieve. For example, imagine for a moment that all schools in the United States were private schools. First of all, that would mean not everyone could afford to have their children educated. In democratic societies where theoretically everyone has the right to vote, that would obviously be a pretty big problem. Also, more schools would be built in areas where more people live and can afford schooling, meaning that there would be rural areas where there aren't many schools nearby. What that means for our purposes is that sometimes the interactions between property and markets don't produce the benefits that we as a society desire. This is why we also rely on states to provide certain essential things as public goods. So public goods are all around us. They are any goods that are provided by the state for society, including roads, bridges, police, fire departments, national defense, schools, and even healthcare. Different states will provide different kinds of public goods, but all states provide some public goods. These goods are made available to everyone in society, and their consumption does not reduce their availability. Now that we've looked at these basic concepts, we need to talk about the impact that states have on economies. In particular, we're going to talk about taxes, social expenditures, and the ways in which states can control and manage natural resources. States play all kinds of roles in the economy. In the first place, states create and regulate money. But states also create rules for the exchange of goods and services, which are called regulations. States regulate what goods can be brought in from foreign countries and how goods produced domestically can be shipped abroad. These are called trade or international commerce regulations. States also influence the economy through social expenditures, which are programs designed to help disadvantaged or vulnerable groups. And if you're wondering where states get the resources to do all of these things, the answer is, of course, taxes. There are many different types of taxes that governments can impose. Governments can impose a tax on things from the income that people earn, business profits, purchases in the form of value added or sales taxes, the value of the property that people or businesses own, the value of stocks and other financial instruments, or the import or export of goods and services to foreign countries. All of the countries that we study have to raise revenue by imposing taxes. And while nobody likes taxes, I think almost all of us are going to agree that we need to have a government with the capacity to do things. The big question then is how much a government collects in taxes and what impact that has on the economy in that country. So, comparing taxes in different countries can be really tricky because we just saw how many different kinds of taxes governments can collect, and the amount can vary widely from country to country. In order to compare the taxes collected across different countries in a meaningful way, we should look at taxes as a percentage of GDP. What this bar graph shows us is what percentage of each country's total annual economic output, or GDP, is collected in taxes. Some countries collect a pretty large share of GDP in taxes. The United Kingdom and Sweden each collect around 25%, and Denmark collects as much as a third of total GDP in taxes. Other countries like Mexico, Russia, and China collect considerably less in taxes. For Mexico and Iran in particular, a low tax rate like this is possible because the state owns and controls the sale of its oil, meaning that the government does not need to collect as much in taxes. Most state revenue in these countries comes from the sale of natural resources. The same thing is true for Nigeria, but I don't have much good data on taxes collected in Nigeria. The data presented in this graph is from the World Bank's database, and they're not really reporting much data on Nigeria. Earlier, we talked about public goods. States also often provide something that we call social expenditures, public benefits, or welfare. These include things like unemployment assistance, job training, and even housing. Most often, these kinds of benefits go to the poor, unemployed, elderly, disabled, and other vulnerable groups in society. Social expenditure is any money spent by a government to support the standard of living of disadvantaged or vulnerable groups, such as the elderly or the disabled. Governments implement these kinds of policies to reduce poverty, increase literacy, and improve public health, both to improve citizens' lives and to maintain or bolster political legitimacy. A moment ago, I talked about how Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria control the oil industries in their countries. All of the countries that we will study control some natural resources to some extent, but the degree of private control over natural resources varies. Of the countries that we study, the United Kingdom allows the most private control of natural resources, and China allows the least. Russia, for example, owns a majority stake in Gazprom, a natural gas company in Russia. That really cool building in the picture on the left is Gazprom's headquarters in St. Petersburg. In Mexico, state ownership of oil is written into the Constitution. The National Petroleum Company of Mexico is known as Pemex, and it has faced some challenges that we'll discuss later in this unit and again in our unit on Mexico. Iran's oil company is known as the National Iranian Oil Company, and we're going to be talking about that one a lot when we talk about authoritarian regimes and again when we study Iran. When a state takes control of private assets and brings them under public ownership of a national government or state, we call that process nationalization. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russia began a rapid transformation from a state-controlled economy to a free market or capitalist economy. Because this change happened so quickly, many economists called this change shock therapy. After Vladimir Putin was elected president in 2000, though, he started to undo a lot of this privatization and kind of threw things into reverse. He began to renationalize the oil and gas industries, and sometimes the Russian government did so in some pretty blatantly corrupt ways. In 2003, for example, Russia's government wrongly prosecuted Yukos oil owner Mikhail Khodorkovsky and forced him to sell his company at auction to an energy company Gazprom, which I mentioned a moment ago is mostly owned by the Russian government. This is a really good time to talk about some of the different political economic systems that we're going to hear a lot about. You may often hear words like capitalism, socialism, and communism used, but they're rarely used correctly. Let's look at what each of these terms actually means, the role the state plays in each of these political economic systems, and the extent to which economic freedom and equality is emphasized in each of them. So, we've talked about how the state can play less or more of a role in the economy. The more involved the state is in the economy, the more taxes it will collect. The more public goods and services it might provide, the more industries it will nationalize, and so on. The kind of political economic system where the state plays a very limited role, and most or all goods and services are provided through a kind of free market, is what we can refer to as capitalist. Most developed countries, though, are what we can call social democracies. In this kind of political economic system, the government provides a good deal of public goods and services in order to do all the good stuff that we talked about earlier, like reducing poverty, increasing literacy, improving public health. This kind of system is often also called a welfare state because the government intervenes in the economy somewhat in order to try and provide for the public welfare. Countries that operate in this way include countries like Germany and France, Nordic countries like Norway and Finland, the United Kingdom, and even the United States. Now, when the state starts to take total or near total control of the economy, we can refer to that kind of political economic arrangement as communism. Now, to be honest, more often than not, it's probably more correct to use the term command economy for reasons that we sometimes discuss in class, if we have time, and you might learn about in your macroeconomics courses. But for now, it's just important to understand that the role of the state is different across these political economic systems. We should take a closer look at each of these systems in turn. When we talk about capitalism, we're referring to a system where goods and services are largely privately owned with little or no state intervention. Now, that doesn't mean the state has no role. The state still has the job of protecting private property, enforcing contracts, and breaking up monopolies. Fareed Zakaria wrote about the important role that the state plays even in capitalist systems in his 2003 book, The Future of Freedom. He writes, "Supporters of free markets often make the mistake of thinking of capitalism as something that exists in opposition to the state. When it is time to pay taxes, this view can seem self-evident, but the reality is more complex. Only a legitimate, well-functioning state can create the rules and laws that make capitalism work. If one wanted to see what the absence of government produces, one need only to look at Africa. It is not a free market paradise." I think his point is that yes, a capitalist system means the state's role in the economy is limited, but without a functioning state that protects property rights, business contracts, and consumer demands, capitalism won't really work the way we would want it to. Social democracies seek to balance economic freedom and equality. The state plays much of the same roles as it does in a capitalist system, but it will also redistribute wealth through taxes and provide more public goods and services. The government plays a role in providing education, health services, regulations to protect the environment, and basic infrastructure for transportation and communication. Citizens depend on states and governments to secure their persons, but also to provide some social safety nets for the less well-off and for education so that everyone has access to opportunity. Finally, let's take a look at communism. Communism is a really interesting political economic system. In our class, we're going to learn about two countries that experimented with communism in the 1900s, Russia and China. To understand communism, you have to know that the goal is to maximize economic equality. In his Communist Manifesto and other writings, the German philosopher Karl Marx argued that the problem with industrial capitalism was that it would lead to growing inequality between the propertied classes and the working classes. Those with wealth would always have an advantage over those without, And the rich upper class of society would leave the poorer working class further and further behind. At least, that's the way that he saw it. To eliminate inequality, Marx and other communists believed all property had to be abolished. The trouble is that this is really tricky to do in practice. Both the Soviet Union and China tried it and nationalized almost all industries. They set prices and they controlled wages. In both cases, this system became really cumbersome and totally unmanageable. The Soviet Union collapsed, and China's economy today has moved really far away from this kind of command system that they had tinkered with between 1949 and the early 1980s. If we try and visualize how much economic freedom and equality is prioritized in each of these systems that we've talked about, we can kind of picture a diagram like this one. Here we can see that capitalism values economic freedom, while communism emphasizes equality. Social democracy is somewhere in the middle and is characterized by governments with an active role in finding a balance between economic freedom and equality. Last, we should talk about the topic of economic liberalization, which is something that we're going to come back to again and again in our course. Governments pursue economic liberalization in order to try and promote growth and development. But to understand how that works, let's take a closer look at what economic liberalization is, what philosophy guides it, and some of the impacts of economic liberalization. So we said that governments pursue economic liberalization to try and promote economic growth. The term means exactly what it says: provide more economic freedom or reduce the government's role in the economy. By eliminating subsidies and tariffs, privatizing government-owned industries, and opening the economy to foreign direct investments, governments hope to create more opportunities for businesses to thrive and for people to find employment. The philosophy behind a lot of this kind of thinking is what's known as neoliberalism. It's a political economic philosophy that promotes limiting government intervention in the economy and society. It supports privatization, free trade, and deregulation. Governments pursue this kind of economic liberalization for a whole host of different reasons, like reducing unemployment, promoting economic growth, reducing trade deficits with other states, and to tackle problems like a shrinking demand for natural resources they can produce at home. Most of the countries that we study have pursued economic liberalization in recent decades, and there have been some good benefits that came of it, but some negative side effects as well. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping began to move China away from its centrally planned communist economy, and the Chinese government established special economic zones, mostly along the Pacific coast. These special economic zones implemented economic policies more attractive to foreign businesses than the rest of China, and led to a boom in manufacturing. To this day, when we talk about China's economic success, a lot of that success has to do with all of the economic development that has taken place in these regions. Now, during his time in office, Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto attempted to open the national oil company Pemex to foreign investment for exactly the same reasons. The company's productivity had been declining, and Peña Nieto had made it a campaign promise to institute changes to draw in foreign investment, make Pemex more profitable, and promote growth. Today, the way Pemex is structured has changed somewhat. But because state control over Mexico's natural resources is written into Mexico's constitution, these changes have met a lot of challenges, and the reforms were ultimately pretty limited in scope. So let's take a look at some of the negative impacts of economic liberalization. In the first place, economic liberalization often leads to growing inequality. There are a few reasons for this. If a state cuts taxes, this means that it must also reduce the social expenditures and the public goods that it provides. For the poor, this can create challenging situations where some of their basic needs that used to be provided by the state are now harder to afford. What's more, economic liberalization has led to a large degree of population migration across different countries. As some regions or countries became more economically active, people were drawn to relocate from less developed regions or countries. Now, this isn't really a problem in and of itself, but it quickly leads to a whole host of other problems. But perhaps one of the most lasting effects of economic liberalization can be the environmental destruction that often comes with it. When governments seek to encourage more economic activity, they often reduce regulations. Now, the trouble is that some of these regulations exist as protections against unwanted harms, like energy companies polluting the air or finance companies exploiting customers. Earlier, we talked about how Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto had begun a process to reform Pemex beginning in 2013 to bring in foreign investment and to try to make the national oil company more competitive and productive. But in addition to that, he also began a process of eliminating price controls that fixed the price of gasoline and allowed fuel prices to rise by 20% in January 2017. Sure, this meant that the government no longer had to pay large fuel subsidies, but many Mexican citizens were outraged and took to the streets in protest. This is a good example of how economic liberalization can lead to a growing inequality, as less wealthy and vulnerable people are hit much harder by cuts like these than wealthier individuals in society. We also talked about the establishment of special economic zones in China, which had led to extraordinary economic growth in these regions. Another consequence of this, though, has been the migration of millions of people to these cities over time. Because this creates challenges like overpopulation, the Chinese government has tried to limit and control this movement of people. Much of the migration of people has been from the countryside to the cities of China, where jobs and economic opportunity are more readily available. And for this reason, we sometimes call this rural-urban migration. Last, economic liberalization has also led to some unwanted consequences for the environment. In Nigeria, for example, the State Department of Forestry has not implemented any forest management policies since the 1970s. As a result, between 1990 and 2010, Nigeria lost over half of its forest cover. This has led to problems like loss of wildlife and soil erosion. A lot of what's driving this deforestation is the expansion of agriculture, the construction of infrastructures such as roads, and the unsustainable use of wood for fuel. Because Nigeria's government encourages growth in these industries, it's reluctant to regulate deforestation. So in this presentation, we've talked about some basic economic concepts, the role that the state plays in shaping the economy, different political economic systems that we need to be aware of, and the positive and negative impacts of economic liberalization. For more information and additional resources, please check in the description below this video. And remember to subscribe to catch more of our videos. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.